Thanks, everybody. Okay, well, let's start with a story. I was in Lexington, Kentucky a few days ago with my wife. We went down to get coffee in the morning. Lexington's great. Everybody needs some coffee. And the barista saw my T-shirt. We made him at work. The T-shirt said, "Starting Zookeeper." And so she started asking me what that meant. As some of you might know, when you do the command line for Apache Zookeeper, that's what you see. I told her about this, and she started talking to me about her passion, which is robotics. She was seemingly a high school student, potentially an immigrant to the country rather, and was fascinated with robotics. And so I asked her, "What's your favorite part?" And she was saying that each team, when you go to a competition, gets the same brief. So what your robot's got to do, what the parameters are, what you're going to be judged on. And her favorite part was going to the competitions and seeing all the diversity, all the different robots, all the different scripting languages, and all the different ways that the people solved the same problem. And it really struck me as that we have some of that analogous in our experiences, at least in my experience, when a client or a product manager gives us requests, and then our team adds that kind of secret sauce, some of the best practices to it. We go forward in a way that sometimes, at least if you're like me, is like, this is the way. This is the way we're going to go. It seems sometimes like the way. And just challenged me to open my mind with her story of there's many ways in the old parlance to skin the cat. And just as we go forward today, just for the next 30 minutes, just challenging you all to open your minds. As we add folks like designers to our teams, we don't want to throw out everything that we're good at, but just reconsidering some of the things that we might view as certain. And so the kind of the core idea is, what if with designers, what if we could serve, our DevOps could serve people instead of sometimes only our certainty? And so that's kind of what we want to push on today. Just a little bit about me. I'm from St. Louis. My wife and I and our family have been there for about 10 years, and then I grew up in Omaha. And so this area of Kansas City is super familiar to me. We drive kind of the L between I-70 and I-29 quite a bit, and so glad to be here. I'm also a little bit jealous of your conference organizer team. It seems like they've really keyed in on what y'all are looking to do here in this area, and it's super awesome to see how they're supporting you and what you're able to do when you all come together. So this is super fun for me to be here. So we're going to talk about adding design to DevOps through this lens of collide, collaborate, and commit. And I thought that would be a great lens for us just to keep with this conference theme. One thing that I like to keep in mind is that some of us are programmed, just because of the way we came up and the web came up, right? Table-based stuff. And all that, that we never want to go back to, but that we sometimes are just even programmed, even subconsciously, when we interact with other practitioners, right, that aren't in this CI/CD space, that we're not talking about all these iterations with, that we interface with them more as like, you're going to do your thing one time, then you're going to be done and go away. Let's kind of, maybe not get it over with, but kind of one and done. That it's easy to slip into this thing that we're making one thing that's going to be finished, and then we don't have to deal with it anymore. And that's one of the main things we want to reconsider as we dive in. But before we dive in, can anybody shout out, why do you do DevOps? What are some of the reasons that you're in this field to begin with? Does anybody have any things that come to mind real quick? Repeatability, maybe adds to some certainty. Good pay. Phenomenal. That's a great reason. So I'm going to ask us to kind of look through this lens for a minute, just for this talk, as DevOps being some degree of adding the infrastructure and the process that provides continuous value to users. Now you're saying, Simon, I didn't come to this talk for you to force your St. Louis stuff on me, and I'm saying, I don't mean to, but I don't think, if we broke this down, right, infrastructure, several people have already today talked about infrastructure. That's not foreign to many of us. Process, even if it's just as simple as we're not all probably on our teams all working against master and committing to master on the Git repo, right? There's some kind of order of operations to what we do that we subscribe to, but then continuous value to delight users. Whoa, is that what we're committing to do? And so that's kind of where we want to go, is when we do this collide, collaborate, and commit stuff, and especially when we add designers, what are we really trying to do here, and how is that working? And so first we collide. A story about this, and again, you're like, did I come to a DevOps conference to learn about animation characters, right? But this is a great story. So in 1995, some of you might remember the Toy Story movie. So this is like, what do Toy Story, Buzz Lightyear, and Olaf from Frozen have in common? and this has a point, I promise you. In 1995, Pixar was very successful with Toy Story, the first Toy Story movie, but they didn't know that. Even a couple months before, right, Steve Jobs was considering selling Pixar software instead of stories in the films. And so when it took off, everybody was very pleasantly surprised, and they immediately started work on Toy Story 2. Well, the book Culture Code talks about kind of the zoomed in on the story of Toy Story 2, the movie, and when they had to reboot it at the 11th hour. And so they were hard at work on Toy Story 2, and it was not good. As some of these tidbits that you hear from the team, it was not good. So they had to decide to reboot it at the 11th hour. They didn't want to become a company known for just releasing to VHS, right? We can all respect that. And so through the process of rebooting for Toy Story 2, they cemented not only the movie, the film, but they also cemented the Pixar culture. And so that would continue for the next decade and beyond, right? And they created titles that we probably at least know of through our pop culture lens, if not are very familiar with. During the same time, Disney, that used to be king of the castle, released something like this. A few titles that we might remember. I can sing Mulan with the best of them if you want to have a karaoke later. But some of these I haven't even seen and didn't even know existed until I Googled it. So about 2006 was when this changed. Bob Iger from Disney, the chairman, bought Pixar and put the Pixar executive team in charge of both Disney and Pixar. People were like, whoa. This is very controversial. They didn't want to mix cultures. They didn't know if they were just going to merge. What was this going to look like? Nobody knew. Well, about 7 years later, we got Frozen. That's what was going to happen. So even with inflation, right, $364 million total for Toy Story was a success in 1995. And even with inflation, $1.3 billion, and that's before international sales for Frozen. That is amazing. And people were like, how'd you do it? To Ed Catmull and team that did this flip. And one of the main observations that they made was it wasn't a staffing change. There were some executives that left Disney during the switch, but it wasn't a vast different group of people that did the B-list movies from the decade before from Frozen. It wasn't different people. And so Ed Catmull's point was they zoomed in on systems and structures that affected how people interacted with each other, and that's where they made the changes. They changed the way that people interacted with each other, and that's how they flipped the script. So as we collide, we want to be really interested in how we interact with each other and changing that. I think this is important for a few reasons, but specifically as we're partnering with designers and we're really focused on serving users, right? That's a lot of the design feedback that we're going to get, and a lot of their input is going to be, what do the users need? How are we going to make our applications more user-centric? We want to create a place for designers in our workflow. So a really practical way that you can do this to take back to your teams tomorrow, you don't have to do this, but just a suggestion, is a tool called Abstract. Abstract is a basically Git for designers. Has anybody heard of Abstract out here? Okay, so it provides what we know and love from Git in a design mentality. So a really good use case for this, has anybody ever gotten like version 00006 of a design comp, and they had already 0005 version, and the designer's like, make the changes that I just did? Has anybody ever kind of gotten this thing? So you have to kind of decide what changed, and you're trying to put this into the code without really knowing what's going on. And so just like we can send diffs from GitHub, Abstract is a type of tool that allows you to do diffs with design files. It hooks up to very popular current tools like Sketch that designers like to use. You don't need to know Sketch, right? But it allows them to send you a link just like you might send them a link. It could be really helpful and put, again, collaboration tools together that helps them fit in with your existing workflows and lets them go as fast as you are. But whatever tools we use, those are very important, but whatever tools we use, like Disney, like this example that we talked about, we need to make some specific changes to optimize the way we interact. And a big one is aligning around serving users. And so one recommendation I would make to go back to your team is to have the conversation, especially if you're working with designers. Are you all aligned with serving users? Are you all aligned with creating value for users? And is that okay to change some of your conversations to reflect that? It's okay if there's some meetings that are like, we're going to switch from AWS to Google Cloud and da-da-da-da-da. But at the end of the day, right, a user doesn't necessarily care. They're not going to know. And so some of those interactions, too, are going to have to be around more high-level problems. And that's just something that many of us are going to have to adjust to a little bit. But that's why we started with talking about an open mind. There's some of our best practices that we're going to continue, but we're just going to have to adjust a little bit as the team expands. So challenging us all to talk about how we're aligned as a team to go forward. And that's to the next phase, right? Collaboration. So a story around this, I have a really good friend that is taught me whatever little I know about design. And we came up together and moved to St. Louis about the same time together. And he worked at a firm where most of his job was to design coupons. I don't know about you, but maybe it would be the equivalent for some of us of having master's degrees in computer science and making blogs all day. It's not going to be that enjoyable for us. That's not where we're going to find enjoyment. So the other stuff that they did was licensed art. And so he kind of hacked this solution where he would do his own painting work that then he would transfer to these licensed art. He didn't sign it, he didn't take credit for it, but it sold millions of copies through things like Crate and Barrel contracts and beyond. I also knew a photographer that changed careers from working with their hands to photography. And I was talking to them about their business, and they're like, Simon, I'm really struggling. And I was asking them, why are they struggling in photography? And they said, well, I'm not going to give any negatives to my clients that I've taken photos for. I'm not going to give them any digital copies of these. The only copies I'm going to sell them are what they order from me, which I would assume has a markup on it. And you're not paying Walgreens prices. And he's like, and I insist on signing every copy that I sell with a silver Sharpie. And I was blown away. I was like, why are you doing that? And he was like, well, this is my art. And I was taken back, right? So if you compare and contrast these two stories, I think, again, part of what I'm trying to get at is our fulfillment. How do we deal with fulfillment and certainty? And again, the way that this is going to trace back and be applicable to us is, we have other, as the saying goes, sacred cows. So is it code formatting? Do you want things to be just so? Or testing, right? Everything needs to be tested exactly to your specifications. Speed, right? Some people might be like, we're going to make the fastest application, and it's going to be on this newest cloud infrastructure. What are we doing again? What's the point of the application? And you get some of these things a little bit out of order. Or, right, some of us might be kind of wearing a badge of firefighter. Like I'm proud that I can solve all of these problems really, really quickly through DevOps. That's great, but we need to make sure we understand what we're solving for, right, and who we're solving for. Or it could be the opposite of, woe is me, I'm a victim, all I can do is firefight. And all of these things, right, are important to note because when we collaborate, what we do is make space for each other. And that's a big part of collaboration. And so what I want us to think about on this point is how do we become facilitators of collaboration? So in this space, what we're talking about is adding design to DevOps. Often designers are coming into your hood, so to speak, right? They're coming into your existing workflow. And for them to be successful, you're going to have to facilitate collaboration with them. You're going to have to make space for them. And that's really important. So a practical example would be if you could use something like Abstract that we just talked about, that software, they could send you links for giving you the direction for the design that might influence how you write the software and what it looks like. But what could you give them? So in our project right now, for an example, we are saying that we are going to merge and branch off of dev branch, and we're going to do PRs and pull requests back into the dev branch. And by the time we do code reviews on dev, that should be all the testing should be done, right? Everything should be buttoned up and it should be ready to go out to the environment. Well, I can't send a link to the designer for feedback until I do that code review right now. And so it creates this situation where the designer's giving me feedback, I'm implementing that feedback, and by the time the designer has a chance to look at it, I'm going to be hard-pressed to want to change it because I've spent all that time on unit testing and all that kind of stuff. So how are we making space for this collaboration, and what is that going to look like? And just really owning it, it's going to rely on us. And what I want to challenge us with specifically as we move to the next point is that I believe our ability to facilitate collaboration with each other, our technical peers and our design peers, is going to have a direct impact on our users of our software products. I think that how we work together ultimately has a direct impact. It's just a few steps removed. And so really being mindful of that as we move forward is we can facilitate collaboration. We don't have to wait for anybody's permission. We can invite other people in and make space for them. And that is going to be both for our technical peers and our non-technical peers. So then the next part is committing. this is a photo from 2 summers ago. It's with some of the folks I was working on as a consultant, and we rode scooters to lunch a lot. The point of this story is first of all, I'm not a daredevil. This is about the most exciting my life gets, is riding around on scooters. I didn't die, although we had a near accident right before this photo. But let's not take all the joy out of commitment. So commitment is kind of this word that scares people sometimes. And I know we've talked a lot about it today, so maybe it's a little easier to hear now. But just as we move forward and talk about making commitments to each other, there's a lot of fun parts of this too. And so I just wanted to touch on that as we start. So as we commit to go together, one of the things that we've found really helpful is establishing working agreements. I know we've talked a little bit about Agile today. Has anybody ever created working agreements with their team or as part of their process starting Agile? Okay, so I don't know about you. I've done a few, actually several, and normally the team decides this kind of stuff together, which is totally fine, but in the situations I've been in, it's a little bit just what's top of mind. So maybe it's what days do we want to work from home, or what days are we not going to have meetings. Maybe we touch on the definition of done for code reviews. All those things are great, and I would encourage everybody to keep talking about those things. But what we want to suggest in this section are things that we could add that cut a little deeper and help us really get an apples-to-apples relationship with everybody on the team, specifically our non-technical peers. So here's what we suggest to put on user agreements, and we're working on an ebook about this right now too if you want to dive deeper. But first of all, clarifying the types of deliverables. So if you're a standard developer, right, if you're working on front-end or back-end code, even if you're doing your configuration in code in your repos, your deliverables are going to be pretty clear. It's mostly going to be centered around code you commit, and with all of the different Agile processes or waterfall processes combined with your deployment processes, your deliverables are going to be pretty clear. This gives you the opportunity to help clarify the deliverables that others are going to submit. So it gives you a proactive place to say, hey, what are you going to bring to the table? And what can I hold you accountable for? The very same piece of that extends, we've alluded to for both technical and non-technical deliverables, is a way to share things. So you can share a link to a cloud environment or development environment or a UAT environment. You can share links to your code. What are they going to share with you? How are they going to interact with you? And what's that going to look like? Be clear about all that stuff up front. Make it equal so everybody's participating. Also clarify input and inform. So what are you going to be informed of? You need to know a lot of things as a team member on a project, but what do you expect to have input on versus just be informed of? This kind of hails back to the old racy matrix idea. You don't need to do a full matrix. You can if you want to, but just the idea of what does everybody need to be informed of versus given input on. Go through that and just be really clear about that. Next is feedback. How do you want to get feedback? How do they want to get feedback? So oftentimes there's this kind of power struggle, especially when you're working with designers that have a high quality expectation. Who's driving what? Who's deciding what? Make it really clear up front. How are they going to give you feedback? First, right, they're going to deliver some deliverables to you. The dev team is going to talk about how they want to implement some of those ideas. How are those conversations going to go? How are you going to decide when things are on the bubble, when level of effort is up in the air, when some things might take longer than you'd like to? How are those decisions going to be made? And then from there on, as you move forward, right, we're all familiar with a lot of different ways where we might do code reviews, whether that's on Slack or maybe it is on a comment thread on your GitHub or system of choice. Maybe you get in a room together and you look through the code on a TV. All of those things we would be able to kind of pick and choose to find the best ways to work with our technical peers. Find similar ways to work with your design peers so that there's a formal way that you all do feedback so it doesn't get personal. And just be really clear about that up front. And then order of operations. So again, in this vein of facilitating collaboration, you have a pretty strong workflow if you're in a strong DevOps culture. It's part of our responsibility as stewards of that workflow to make space in that, so you have a little bit of ability to direct this. But be clear about where the space is. How are order of operations going to work? When are you going to involve design? When is design then going to be incorporated? How are you going to work the user stories from start to finish? How is the product team going to be involved? All that kind of stuff. Just be really clear so that everybody can have this working agreement going forward. And what that results in is, as a developer, you have all of this transparency in your work, right? You have peer review, all these kinds of things built in that we've really come to trust and know enhances our ability to work together. And this is your turn to advocate that other people do similar things to that so that you're all on an even playing field. So what does this look like in practice? We have just a few minutes left to talk about this, a few practical suggestions of how we can implement this with our teams. And this is kind of to harken back to my barista story that I started with. This is not the way, this is a way, right? These are suggestions. The best way is the way that works for your team. So in this example, we'll use some ingredients of Agile Scrum with user stories on a Kanban type board, some component-driven design, which we'll spend a minute on, and then some feedback stuff. And the whole kind of moral of the story, to not bury the lead, is this is 2019, and this is all very possible. So everything that we're going to suggest should be implementable with a reasonable level of effort. So the first thing is a really simple idea is when we're facilitating collaboration and inviting other people, technical or non-technical people, right, even testing folks, but especially designers, onto our team, one easy thing to do that you can do on day one is to make a column for them on your board. So maybe your stories start in the backlog and they progress and matriculate through the rest of the board with a recipe that your team has decided on. It would be helpful if design had a column. And this is one very, very easy and simple way, right? It takes 30 seconds in most of our systems, Jira or Microsoft DevOps, to make a column on the board. This is an easy way that you can take 30 seconds to facilitate collaboration on your team. Another way, which is a little bit more intense and involved, is doing what I call a component library. So this is the idea of reusing code, mainly JavaScript and CSS, that mostly controls the appearance and the behavior that the user is engaged with, and to distill that into components that are reusable. If you're talking to designers about this, what I would suggest on being really clear is that this is not the bottom of the barrel or the top. So the bottom of the barrel would be that they might hear you suggesting to just use something like Twitter Bootstrap off the shelf. And their reaction to that, right, is going to be, I don't want my thing to look like Twitter Bootstrap. I don't want it to be one of the next, 1,000,001 sites to look like Twitter Bootstrap. So to be clear with them, that's not what you're advocating for. I would call that a design framework. Something like Twitter Bootstrap, or in the JavaScript framework world, something like Vuetify that establishes a lot of the material theme standards into code. So then we'll go from the top. The top, I'm calling it a design system. So this is where you might come in with some kind of methodology. It could be material or otherwise, and you spend a considerable amount of time, I'm talking months, mostly with designers and front-end developers, making a whole design system that probably goes with brand standards, that's intended to use across a corporate suite of applications for a significant amount of time, years, months, a big effort. And we're not talking about that either. So we're trying to shoot in the middle, and that's what I'm calling a component library. And Brad Frost has given us a lot of examples of how we think about this, so that's something to research if you want to go further with this. But it's the idea of breaking up your pieces of design into components, which hopefully your designers are somewhat familiar with this. This isn't just new to them, but the idea that atoms are the smallest piece, something like a button. Molecules would be something that's a little bit more a grouping of something. So maybe a button and an input field, for example. Organisms get more robust. So maybe a sign-up form for an email newsletter could be an organism, for example. And then a template might be a collection of those organisms in a reusable page. So a blog roll of a system, or maybe one style of landing page or home page that your app uses, or if you're in the native mobile space, maybe it's a list view of something. So those would be kind of templates. And then a page would take that template and all the other components that roll up into it and be a unique page with specific content, images, and those things that make that page unique from all the other sites. Sorry, all the other pages. Excuse me. The way we talk about this and kind of the definition I put around it is component-driven development as the word, and that it's a methodology that changes the way designers and developers interact with each other from the bottom up by building UIs from the bottom up. And so as we talk about, again, that Disney example about doing this chiropractic adjustment and changing the way that we work with each other, this is a big thing that you can add. Now, a common pushback that I get about from this, even from my peers, right, I'm learning with you, this is current thought, is that level of effort. Simon, you're asking us to do this. This is going to take way too much time to make reusable components, to test reusable components. Why would we spend this much time when we can just get in and get out and move on? And my thought is it all goes back to this assumption of, are we working towards launch, or are we working towards a product mindset, right? We've heard about that this morning, something that lives on, that we're doing consistent releases on, and that we're caring for long term. And if we're working with a product mindset, then we might imagine that there's going to be new pieces of the product, new features of the product, and things that we're going to want to care for, like bug fixes and stuff like that, that any way we can invest in an economy of scale now is going to help us down the road, right? And that might be, actually, as DevOps folks, that might be one of the biggest encouragements that we can bring to the mix, because a lot of our world is about economy of scale. And so this might be one way that you could really advocate for something that could help your team. If you look at this kind of in a workflow state, what we're suggesting with this bottom-up approach is that we have this one UI circle, the idea that when designers give you a page layout, you're breaking that into these components, organisms, molecules, those kind of things, and you're building those into code. So instead of building a whole page and then going to build another page and then going to build another page, you're building a button, and you're building these collections of components, and then you're going and putting those back on the page. So on the UI loop, you're building the components, you're testing the components, and then as you're working out features in your application and you're working through user stories, you're applying those components into your feature set. The last piece of this recipe that we found really helpful is feedback. So this site is a fictitious site, but the sidebar and kind of this red arrow are part of a system called BugHerd. And BugHerd, there's got to be other things like it, but it's one of the main ones I've found that it allows you to put feedback on a DOM element. So the red arrow points to the little map marker icon on the screen, and that map marker icon, sometimes on our sites that use BugHerd for feedback, the end user doesn't see this, but when you're in development mode, you might see many map markers on the screen. And that's a way that we can give feedback on the DOM, right, in a context where the developers and the designers can all see it in a place that makes sense to them, and they can see it in context. One of the main pushbacks I get about this is that BugHerd is a full ecosystem, so it has its own Kanban board and kind of its own administrative UI too. And one of the main pushbacks I get on this is, I'm not doing another board. I can't have another thing that I look at for bugs. That's fine, right? You can integrate with your APIs. You can have BugHerd spit these bug reports out into your system. You don't have to use another tool, right? We're all proficient enough with API integration, or we can use something like Zapier to do it for us in 30 seconds. But the point is that we really get down specific, right? Going back to that Pixar, Disney analogy, specific systems and structures that change the way we interact with each other. Being able to give feedback on the DOM in context is really helpful. It gets specific enough that we can actually work together well. It depersonalizes things. It makes our feedback really effective. So that's one more thing. In closing, Dan and Chip Heath wrote a book several years ago called Made to Stick. And they went through several filters, I think it was 5, that made ideas really sticky. And one of the chapter titles of one of their filters was called Commander Intent. So this idea that when you're in an army or military organization, there's very hierarchical, and every level of leadership and such has their specific orders. And it might be, march to this spot and then hunker down and wait, or it's going to be very specific, right? And depending on your level, the lower the level, the more specific your orders are. But every order also has above it this idea of commander intent, right? So if your orders are not able to be fulfilled, you roll up to the commander intent, and that's what you're trying to do in the big picture. And so commander intent here is do what works for your team. Do what works for you. Don't just say, hey, the dude at KC DevOps said to do this. Get feedback from your team. Do what works for you. And let's, as we do this collide, commit, collaborate stuff, let's remember too that there's a lot of stuff at our disposal since it's 2019, and we have all that we need to go together. So thanks for your time.